Good. Thanks a lot. Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot. Sorry for starting a few minutes late. Those who, first of all, it's a fantastic turn up to this event. GLOVent started something last year we called Wednesday webinars. We haven't been having it every Wednesday, but it's basically a session where we shared some ideas, shared some knowledge with the industry. But today is quite special. Not only that it's the first one of the year that we're having, it's also, if I may say, the biggest turn up that we have. And I think it's for a few reasons. One of it is because it's such a topical topic at the moment. I think reserve management has been an important topic of discussion in South Africa for quite a while. But for a number of reasons, as we've seen, it's becoming top of mind now. So I would assume that's one of the reasons. And then also, I think we're very privileged for the panel of experts we have in this call. First of all, I want to say thank you, and Rob will have a few minutes to introduce himself just now. Rob Felix from America, from the USA. I think in this case, they are bigger and better, maybe not in rugby. So I think it's 4 o'clock in the morning there. So we're really privileged and really privileged to have him here, and great to be able to pick his brain and share a few thoughts on the subject. We also have Jeremy in the call. A lot of you probably know. You want to do a short introduction, and Johan Kruger as well. We're doing it interview style, so I'll ask a few questions and we'll discuss. I know you would really like to chip in or talk, join the conversation. Unfortunately, it's just too big audience, so please you're welcome to type questions, or then at the end of the session, we're going to give a few minutes for questions and answers and deal with as many as we can. Usually we try to keep these webinars to about 30 minutes, but obviously you're welcome to drop off at any time. But again, because of the audience and the people we have here and the interesting topic we're discussing, we're probably going to try and finish by about 2:45 and then leave the last 15 minutes for questions and answers. Okay, so yeah, I think that's the introduction. So again, thank you for joining. I hope it's quite an interactive session, at least between the panel. So for those of you who know GLOVent, what we do, we focus on community management systems, and we try to offer a system to our clients that does full estate or community management, of which one is definitely then reserve management. As we all know, and I'm not the expert on this topic, that's why I've got the guys on the panel, but it's something that's always been important in South Africa, but over the past few years, it became top of mind with sectional titles making it law as well. So a great topic to discuss. I think I'll start off by just asking maybe if each of the panel members can just quickly introduce himself with a brief background, and then we'll go straight into the questions. Maybe Rob, if we can start with you.
I'd be more than happy to. Thanks, Adrian. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you in South Africa, and to always see my good friend Johan. Johan and I have been colleagues for many years now, and we've talked on many topics. I spent 20 years as an estate manager, large scale golf courses, all that sort of noise. Started my reserve study company in 2001. So I've been doing reserve studies now for better than 20 years. Still do a lot of them today, and I have my own strategy about what looks like a good reserve plan, and certainly how to develop one on behalf of our clients. So I appreciate the opportunity. It's always good to be part of this group. I've been part of CAI I've been in the industry for better than 40 years, been part of CAI for probably 36 years, and use a lot of the standards that CAI sets in order to achieve what I think is a good professional plan. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go on to questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of people I think can't just listen to you, but now Johan and Jeremy would love to listen to you as well. So Jeremy, can you maybe also introduce yourself, probably more well known to the industry already?
Yes, of course. So I'm Jeremy Deeble-Rodgers from CORE, and essentially we built the first capital reserve management operating system to market in this country. And obviously we're very committed to trying to put together an easy system to use to try and make sure that people are actually, I think, planning a little bit more diligently, putting a lot more thought into what a capital reserve planning actually should look like as a process, and just trying to make it intuitive and have the support to market to help people with their different functions and with questions that they may have in terms of building a really good process at the end of the day.
Thanks,
Great.
Jeremy. So maybe for those who don't know, if I can just add here, so we've partnered with Jeremy quite a while actually ago, where we integrate or busy integrating the core system, as you know, into the Glow CMS portal, and then GLOVent is, we call it O&M, operating and maintaining the software. So basically, you can gain access to the software that Jeremy and his team has developed through our community management system, Glow CMS. And Johan, thank you. I think you're really well known to everyone in the call, but introduce yourself again. Maybe you can tell us something I don't know. I don't know what that would be.
I think a few people learned today that there's somebody longer in the industry than me, and that's Rob Felix. I mean, he's 40 years. I'm only going on 20 years. So that's on a lighter note. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks for the invitation. And it's really a privilege to share the platform with Jeremy and then my good friend, Rob Felix, who's without, when I asked him, immediately put his hand up. And we're looking forward to get some feedback from him. Briefly on me, I've been in the estate industry since the end of 1999. Big estates, small estates, consulting, all sorts of things. And joining hands with Jeremy and Adrian to provide reserve study solutions to the industry. And as we say in Afrikaans, it's lekker to be here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Johan. And then also maybe to expand again where Johan fits in, as he said, on GLOVent, as most of you have heard, we offer systems. We're a solution company. We're not a services company, but a lot of the systems we offer and these days and develop does have a strong services element to it. And specifically with reserve management, at least what we've seen is, and that will probably come out through this discussion, is that we believe there's a strong services element to the software, and that the software as a standalone might be difficult to navigate, the wrong word. It's probably a good idea to take the services with the software, but let I not give my opinion. But that's how we work with Johan as well. Thank you, guys. I think I'm going to jump directly into to speak a little bit to Rob, if it's okay. I'm getting a bit more experience from the US market, telling us a bit more. I think just in your introduction, you said the lessons you've learned so far, and I think everybody's keen to hear about it. So maybe if you can just start off and just tell us a bit about reserve management in the US. Is it a big thing? Is it law? Is it optional? How does it work? Is it
great way to start off, Adrian? But let me just share that in the US, it wasn't the reason I started my reserve study company was 20 plus years ago, was because reserve studies itself in the US was sort of a nuance. It hadn't yet reached any legislation or anything like that. In today's market, there's about 360,000 community associations in just the US alone. There's probably 10 or 12 reserve study providers that are significant in size. There are 19 of the 50 states of the United States that have some sort of legislation requiring a reserve study. There's only a couple that require funding. We all believe that the board or the committee, as you all know it as, should have responsibility as a fiduciary in the funding model that they choose. And so there is one state out of the US that has, as part of its law, the requirement that the board or the committee actually adopt a policy on how they're going to fund their reserve fund. So that's kind of the nuance of it all in the US. I think I've personally conducted over the last 20 years, which doesn't sound like much when you look at 20 years, but I've personally done about 1,500 reserve studies where I've looked at infrastructure, delved into it, and so forth. And I think that we're going to see the concept of reserve studies continue to merge. Some of you know of the failing of the Champlain Towers in Florida recently. A very sad event, took a number of lives, and it could have been prevented had it had proper engineering and proper funding to repair and replace its infrastructure. So it's sort of highlighted the gap between a requirement for analysis and the need for funding in just the US. I see that being emblematic of what's happening across the world. Certainly in other places, Dubai, where there is just 100% of construction is in some form of deed restricted community. Here in the US, it's about 80%, 85% of the construction is in some form of deed restricted community. And what people are looking for is they're looking for smart developers that actually start reserve funding right at the beginning. Because we all know that components, as a manager, we all know that components start deteriorating immediately. And if we fail to act immediately or at the beginning of construction, then we're always playing catch up all the way down the road. So CAI, the Community Associations Institute, has developed standards for reserve studies. You can find those on the caionline.org. Those are standards for the US, but I think they apply internationally because they're about the standard that we all should adhere to, provide different funding models, and deal with how we gather information and what that information means. I hope that's helpful as sort of a backdrop into reserve studies. I think that as you get deeper and deeper, and one of the reasons to probably use an outside consultant when you're actually doing reserve studies is, personally, I divide all of my components for my buildings. I just am doing a condo in Scottsdale, Arizona, 97 unit condominium building that was built in 2008, and they're already behind the 8 ball. They're 13 years back, and they're now going, gee, we should start saving money. And what we're finding is that there are a lot of things that are going to catch them soon. And so I divide their components between critical components and non-critical components. Critical components are those components that, and I'm sure every manager that's listening today will probably get this, a critical component is a component that if it dies, if it stops working, if it deteriorates, it will have a very negative impact on your members and be costly. And it never dies while you're planning to replace it. It dies at, on a holiday weekend when the building is full of people, and now all of a sudden you got to respond. So critical components are those components that should make every reserve study. And then non-critical components are those components that are fungible, that can move around and maybe move the length of time they should stay active, and before you repair, replace, refurbish. And we all know what those components look like in your own community. But I think it's important to actually get someone from an outside perspective to tell you what's happening elsewhere. And that's what most reserve specialists do, at least in the US.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, that's actually what you started answering my second question. It was just interesting to note that developers are starting to do a reserve fund. So I can just imagine, I haven't been a estate manager, but I lived in a few estates, and it's been difficult to get the final swimming pool out of developers. So I can just imagine getting a nice big reserve fund from them might be quite a challenge, but it's very progressive thinking. It's nice. So yeah. Basically, the second question was, is basically, if you are a reserve, that's what you do as a service to communities or to estates, as we call it. And then I know it's probably oversimplified, but on a high level, the process. So now a client can approach you and said, we really need to do this thing now, and where do we start? If you can maybe just talk us through the high level steps, how to go about it at the end of the day.
Well, it's an interesting perspective. I can tell you that at least in the US, the buying public is becoming more and more aware of the need to start the process early on. People are starting to look at the financial health of the estate prior to buying into the estate. And the worst thing is moving into the estate and finding out that there's a special assessment to cover the repair replacement of a critical component, a roof or a pool or whatever. And so what we're finding is that people are more active now than they used to be. There's a lot of us that, I also own a management company, an estate management company. So we manage a lot of communities on a different division. And we are working with developers who are smart enough to know that they need to start early on in the process. And of course, it's never too late to start the process. But there are a couple of philosophies in reserve studies which I think are really critical. And the first one is that how many dollars you have in the bank is not really material. It's how many dollars you need versus how many dollars you have in the bank, the percent funded that you are, and not just how much from a percentage you have in the bank, but what path are you on over a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year cycle to fund those repairs and replacements. I may be going off a little bit, Adrian, but you tell me if I need to stop. But
no, please just talk 100%.
But what we find is that if we can get a client, a community, and a state on a funding path that the board decides is a reasonable risk for them to avoid special assessments, the failing of a component, not having any money to repair, replace it, so on and so forth. If we can get an estate on a funding path, that is the strongest position to be in. And that funding path in the US, one of the companies here called Association Reserves did a study a number of years ago on 10,000 communities. And it looked at the funding strength of those communities. And what it found was, if you can be on a path to be 70% funded of the total amount of funds you need, if you can be on that path, you have less than a 1% chance of ever running out of money. Now you got to stay on that path. You have to fund it according to what the requirement is, but it's very low risk. Some communities think if they have, if they're 25, 30% funded, that's okay. But the risk is fairly high for the board, the fiduciaries of the community, to actually make reasonable decisions. So the chance of running out of money when you get into that low amount of a funding model or on that path for funding is that you have a very high risk of running out of money. Everything, we try and predict everything when a component will fail, whether it's a brick wall or a roof on a building or a swimming pool or pumps, whatever it is. You try and predict it. And if you predict it wrong and you didn't fund enough, you're on the backside. You're on the tail end of trying to figure out what you're going to do. And there are many communities in the US that have failed to fund those components and then wound up just basically running out of money. They had to go get a loan, which is more expensive if they can get a loan. And devaluation of property is significant. And that's what you're trying to do, is to maintain property's values so it can be resold in the long run.
Excellent. Sure. We should have scheduled 2 hours. I'm sure if we opened it to the floor, we would have a lot of questions. But maybe last comment from you at this point, maybe a few of the common mistakes that you've seen in your years of experience when people do reserve studies, maybe some pitfalls, some tips that we should look out for and then try not to repeat.
Yeah, probably the largest one is to have someone in your community do your own reserve study. I have gone in and corrected reserve studies where all good intention, but someone decided they were going to identify the capital components of a community and put it in a funding model, and they're totally off. And I would just encourage people, using third party is probably critical. Now, obviously I don't do any business there, so I'm not like I'm selling business to you all, but I've seen so many people fail at the concept of trying to get their own, and it gets influenced by the priority of the individual that's doing it. So if someone is a swimmer, their attention is on the swimming pool, but they may miss the access gate, or they may miss security, or they may miss, a roof. So it is not necessarily as broad scoped as it possibly can be. That's probably one of the major pitfalls. The second major pitfall is funding, and that is that no one likes to see their assessment or their maintenance fee go up every year. but we all know that inflation occurs, the cost of labor increases, prices go up. And if you are not continuing to increase your funding, then you stand to go backwards. And I see that so many times here in the US. We don't want to raise our assessment, our maintenance fee. And so they actually go backwards. And that's even worse than starting off with good intention. So I would say that is probably one of the other pitfalls. And finally, I would say this, and that is that not doing a reserve plan, a reserve management plan, is foolish. In the long run, the cost of doing it is outweighed by the benefit of having it. And so if you just stick your head in the sand and say, well, we'll leave it to the next board, which I often see as well, especially in the US, we'll let the next committee deal with that, then it is, then you're ripe for failure. Probably the other thing that I learned as an on-site estate manager for 20 years was that you all as managers have great information. You know when components fail, you know what it takes to manage them and so forth. And your reserve fund developer needs to be talking to you. You guys are the smart ones that are out there. We might have theory, we might be able to look at the manufacturer specs. We might be able to estimate based upon 1,000 other studies that we've done, but you guys are the ones with the information about your community, your estate. And if you're looking for someone to do a reserve study for you, make sure that you're weighing in whether they're asking you the right questions. You guys are the smart ones. One of the reasons, again, I started my own reserve study company is because I was getting reserve studies that somebody was doing, but they were never asking my opinion about things as an estate manager. They were just telling me what I should be doing, and they were wrong.
Sure, excellent. Thanks a lot, Rob. I think and we're going a little bit over the agenda already, but it's all good. So Johan said he doesn't really need to speak. In fact, he's hoping he doesn't have to. But if you can move on to Jeremy, maybe Jeremy. So well, I met you many years ago, and you were going on then already about this reserve thing, which I think no one even, well, in the US maybe they knew what you were talking about, but certainly in South Africa it was a new concept. So and you saw a gap in the market and decided to embark on a journey of actually developing a piece of software or system that facilitates the process of doing the reserve study and also the maintaining of that. At GLOVent, we've definitely learned that developing a system for anything is not an easy task. So can you maybe just expand on your thinking at the time? Why did you see the need for such a system? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Arjun. I think that the big thing that struck me at the beginning of this process was the complete lack of planning done by estates. So, I'm from a financial planning background. So to me, it makes sense to plan for things. And when I first started chatting to the industry, it became quite apparent that this concept of planning for infrastructure replacement costs and perhaps large planned maintenance projects was something that just wasn't planned. So I think the advice to the industry at the time was a thumbsuck of, keep 2 to 3 times annual levy in, and that's what you need for your reserves. And to me, that was horribly unscientific. So I think it was really about efficiencies. And the reason that we wanted to build a tool is because, at that stage, there weren't Rob Felixes that had the intellectual property behind doing capital reserve plans. So we actually did a bit of research into what the US did from a capital reserve planning point of view. And obviously for us, the main elements of a capital reserve planning process was your physical analysis of the estate and having a look at your components. So you imagine back then when Rob's talking now about making sure that your analysis of an individual component is accurate and that you're planning for that component correctly. We were in a landscape, and I think many estates in this country are still in the landscape of, well, we don't even have a proper asset registry. We haven't identified our components. And I think that's, very, very problematic. The other thing that struck me was, I think, equal fault, not just from from an estate management point of view, but from the individual owners within that estate. You speak to a lot of people, certainly you did back then. Nobody ever asked their estate, do you have a capital reserve plan in place? Do you find that you're often needing to ask for special levies? So understanding the financial standing of an estate you're about to buy, probably your biggest asset, into, to me, made no sense at all. So I think that trying to make sure that you've got some kind of a plan in place that accurately can predict what your costs you're going to incur to replace infrastructure are and when they're going to occur is really essential. And one of the things Rob said earlier, to me, it's almost the cart before the horse, because in a perfect world, if you could do a capital reserve plan before your estate is built, and you could quantify which component of your overall levy and the quantum of that component for capital replacement costs, then you wouldn't have this problem. It would be built in. You'd know what you need to be putting away for these future expenses, etc. So I think those were the main reasons for us deciding that we wanted to build a tool. And at that stage, what we wanted to do was to build something that could quite intuitively guide estate managers and their management boards through the process of doing a physical analysis, by making the software quite intuitive and taking them through broadly categorized components and bringing those down into the actual final individual components that maybe make up that asset. But I think that one of the things that we've learned over time is that I think that there's very limited time for estate managers. And whilst this is a very important function, it's not their only function. So I think what we've realized with this process is that it's great to have a tool, but I think you also need some consulting alongside that tool, firstly to help you make decisions and help you interrogate your assets and your components properly, but also to help you through the process and make sure you see it through. We've seen people start reserve plans, start the process, and then either feel overwhelmed by it or get busy again and put it on the shelf, and it never comes to fruition. And I think that it's very important that there's the guidance and perhaps the motivation and the accountability in the space to make sure that people do the exercise properly and end up with a financial reserve plan that they can stand behind and that their board can stand behind, and that can give the information necessary both to themselves for making decisions and impart that obviously to the residents that make up that community.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can you maybe expand a little bit? So we do speak to a lot of clients, a lot of estates, and I think almost everybody's got some sort of a reserve plan at least, or a thumbs up portion of levies percentage. I've seen fantastic calculations on the back of cigarette boxes. Not really, but what we have seen quite often is quite complex Excel spreadsheets. And then I take my hat off to the spreadsheets that's been built. What benefits would your system offer above something like a Excel spreadsheet, if I may, to do this analysis?
Of course, look, I think you can do it with a spreadsheet. I think it's very time intensive. I think you've got to have a very powerful skill set behind the person that built the spreadsheet. And that's often not within the skill, and I mean no disrespect, but it's just not their core focus and function. That's often not what an estate manager is there to do. So often you may find that spreadsheets will come along that a board member built, and maybe that person's a chartered accountant and they've got the necessary skills to build something. But continuity is a big problem there as well. When that board member goes away and they leave a spreadsheet behind for somebody to continue with, I think that's quite difficult to take up, and you need to have the same level of skill to be able to continue to put data into it, interpret the data that comes out of it, etc. So often those things are great at the time, but they don't have much continuity. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that a well-built tool can give probably a lot more information than you can get out of a spreadsheet. So with our particular system, there's quite a lot of scenario planning that goes into the process. So it's not just the time value of money, looking at what the inflationary impact is on a particular component over time. And even that is problematic. A tool's great, but you have to have the thinking that goes along with it. So you need to interrogate what you've done. If you're assuming a fixed inflation rate on a basket of components, that may serve you for a period of time, but you have to have a policy in place within your reserve planning structure to say, well, how often are we going to interrogate those inflationary figures? When do they change? If we've had a major issue and the rand's depreciated and we import a certain basket of components within our overall basket of components, what does that mean for those components? So, there's a lot involved in this process. But I think certainly in terms of having a tool there, it can help you to guide you through certain thought processes that you really should be following. And then obviously from a functionality point of view, there's scenario planning where you can have a look at what is your assumed return on the reserves that you have built up. How are you going to inflate the levy portion that's there specifically for these kind of capital replacement costs? And within that, you can arrive at different levy contributions and look at, if you're in a very difficult financial environment where it's very difficult to get people to part with additional money and you've got an estate that didn't do this properly, you can start building that funding up on a slower basis and understand where you're going with it. I think it's very difficult to do those sorts of things in a spreadsheet. There are other simple things. So, as I've said, I don't necessarily recommend that an estate's going to sit and do their physical analysis themselves. But the system, for example, has a tool that says it's fine for you to put some kind of a value in on a component and put in an estimated lifespan of that component. But where did you get your data from? If you've just sucked your thumb and came up with a figure, that's a problem. So the tool, for example, will have, it has a drop down where you can actually put a supporting document against that component value so that you've got something that if your board or one of your residents turns around and says, well, how did you get to that value? It's there in the system and you can quantify it and you can, have a bit of evidence that you did some homework on this particular thing. So that, especially if you're going to be doing it yourself, is quite important, because I think you need to be held accountable for the data you put into the system, because like with everything, if you put bad information in, you get rubbish out. You're not going to be able to analyze the data properly.
And I'm going to interrupt. I just can't agree. I agree so much with what Jeremy had to say. I'll tell you what, I wish that sort of integrity was built into some of the thinking that comes across in the US. I mean, it is spot on, Jeremy, just spot on. Here's part of the problem. Most of the people that are putting these plans together are not individuals who employ the same plan in their own personal life. So for the most part, people don't start saving when they buy a house. They don't start saving to replace their roof. Or when they buy an automobile, they don't start saving to replace the automobile when it's going to die in 10 years. We don't do that personally. So when we move into these estates, the estate it's a new kind of thought process to start saving for these components that we don't do personally most of the time. And so it is spot on. Good job.
Thanks, Robert. And I think off of what you're saying, I think the other thing that strikes me, and I'm not specifically in the estate management industry, but as an estate management industry, you're the guardians of other people's money. And life is tough out there. You take COVID and what people have been through, you take the cost of living increasing, you take in South Africa living in quite a tough economy with high levels of unemployment. And to turn around and ask somebody for a special levy because you didn't plan properly is really difficult. And I think that there's an accountability there to your end resident and your member who's going through. Everybody has a face at the end of the day, and they've got a family and they've got needs. And I think if you're taking that role of planning effectively and making sure that they are funding it and they understand that expense and they've already bought into it, they don't have these nasty shocks of we're horribly underfunded, let's put in a massive special levy, and you've got to find the money from somewhere. And I think that's important.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Yes, I mean, something that and I sometimes think I'm quite a Power Excel user. I've seen a lot more, but there's to a point where one can model things and do what if analysis and scenarios. And what impressed me of Jeremy's software was, first of all, the level of detail that you can go into, and then also it's not a 5-year plan. It's a 30-year plan that they give you, and then also the scenarios that can be played out. I think Jeremy's up to 6 scenarios that you can add. So what's really useful, I think, because at the end of the day, I suppose you can then even present a few options or scenarios to the AGM and say, guys, this is, if we want to work on a buffer of this amount, it's going to cost us so much, but if we're willing to take a bit more risk and have a lower buffer, we're going to save a bit and almost get the audience or the members to make a decision. So and then the last of that was also the ability to continually maintain the plan. So I mean, the day after you publish the plan, that camera breaks that you didn't anticipate, as Rob said, and you actually replace it. So at that point, your plan has to be adjusted. And with Jeremy's software, you can just update your actuals and it automatically propagates through, and then you see the effect of the plan. So
yeah, you can also build, the other nice thing about the system is you can build a buffer. So, you could miss some components. So it does have an ability there to say, look, in addition to what we've identified, let's build a 10% buffer into that and make sure that we're funding for that. If you're funded over a 30-year period, it also doesn't necessarily mean that you're funded in every one of those years. And a buffer will help to smooth those kind of periods out as well. But I think just one final point on maybe the difference between an Excel spreadsheet and a proper system is also the reporting side. Firstly, it's widely disseminated information, so you can give a report that you can give to your management team and you can give that same report to a resident. And at the end of the day, that gives a really clear picture of what's going on. What components are replaced in what year, what your next year's worth of components are that are up for replacement. And again, as Rob was saying earlier, you may have a list of a number of components where you've got estimated lifespans. And we're not suggesting that next year's list of components you go out and simply replace. There's logic to the process where you need to go and actually now physically assess those components that are up for replacement that year and go, well, hang on, those 6 components of our list of 30 actually still look good. They're not critical components, so we're not taking a risk by leaving them there. And we can roll that component forward into the next year and it'll shuffle everything along from a financing point of view. So that you're applying logic to the information that you're getting as well. We're not suggesting you just use a tool and blindly continue forth. It is a process. It takes an ability to interrogate the information that the system is giving you. And I think that's a key skill set for people that are generating reserve plans, is to understand what they're looking at and understand what the information means to them and their community, and how it can be adjusted to best suit the needs of their residents.
Yeah, and Jeremy, I'll tell you that one of the things I do disagree with on some of the standards is they say you should update your plan every 3 to 5 years. I'm a real advocate that it needs to be adjusted annually, because so much occurs within a year and we learn so much about a component in a specific time period. We have the ability within our states, and when we're setting our levy for the next year, to actually make those minor adjustments to accommodate whatever we're going to need in our funding model, so that we don't run out of money or we don't miss a viable component, a valuable component. And so I think if it's it's a live document, it needs to continually be massaged and needs to be updated, and on an annual basis is at least the minimum.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And the way we did it in our system is to work on a 30-year rolling plan. So essentially at the end of your planning year, you would roll the plan forward and start year 1 of your next 30-year period. And you would interrogate. So you've also got an ability to look at when you last did inputs on individual components, so that if your last accurate data for the replacement cost, for example, of that component has aged beyond a year or 2, you can look at a basket and say, well, that's what we've got to evaluate this year. We don't have to go and evaluate everything from scratch, but these have actually, aged, and we need to get those inputs up and ready and roll everything forward again. So thanks.
Yeah, and by the way, some of those costs don't go down. I mean, one of the things that we have experienced over the years is not everything goes up. technology is applied to some items, then the cost goes down. The length, the useful life of a component changes based upon technology and other things. So you're spot on. It's so critical. Good job.
The software costs typically don't go down in South Africa. No, no, sure. Thank you, Jeremy and Rob. And we're actually already in the question and answer session, and I do see some of the questions that comes in. Thank you, guys. It's unfortunately difficult to answer everybody individually. We'll definitely get back to you as well. So please post your questions. And if you would allow me to go into the question and answer session, I think this session can also continue. Obviously, those who need to fall off are welcome, but I would just also like to quickly bring Johan in here. Johan was probably one of the first estate managers that then took the brave step and said he's going to embrace this project and he's going to do a capital reserve plan or reserve plan for quite a big estate that he was the manager of. So if you can maybe talk us through that process, Johan. I believe you did use the core system at the time. Some of the lessons you learned maybe more closer to home in the local environment.
Thanks, Adrian. I really feel like the guy is called on to tell a joke after Joe Parker and Barry Hilton, after Rob, Felix and Jeremy. Just as a few pointers, for those of you, if Rob speaks about a due or a assessment or a maintenance fee, that's a levy that we refer to in South Africa. And you picked up later in his conversation, he did refer to levies as he has visited us before. We talk about this quite often. So just back to reserve studies, 1 or 2 pointers. I'm with Jeremy, also surprised that it's not something that's really taken off in the industry. Most estates, or the average estate, is probably now getting to 20 years, 25 years. I'm talking about the property boom in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So we are getting older. And our infrastructure are getting older, and I doubted that we're all adequately prepared. The lessons from using the system at the estate that I was at the time is we decided at the time that we're going to take it on as a team. So, I got all the staff, including the accountant, involved, and it was quite a process because there was no reference in South Africa to say, how do you do it, and so forth. But I think the end result was fantastic. I can't comment if they still maintain it, afterwards. And my classic example that I always use, we installed 6 of those big TV screens in the control room, and they got end of life. And as you all know, to convince a board of directors to spend money on TV screens in a control room, it's the one item that you always try and push until it breaks down. And the chairman at the time looked at the reserve study and said, it's due for replacement, let's replace it. It was a 5-second decision made, and we moved on. Made a big difference from an operational point of view from our side. And I see it's the future. We lag a little bit behind America. I know in sectional title, there's some things happening, in terms of maintenance plans and things like that. But it's really, really something on the next wave, if I can put it that way, for estates to focus on the reserve studies, and that what flows from them. Thanks, Adrian.
Okay, just to add something there. I mean, Johan and I actually spent quite a long time and had quite a number of conversations during the process of setting up that reserve study. And I think that was extremely valuable because he taught me a lot about estates, and I taught him a few things about, at that stage, capital reserve planning and the actual analysis of the data that comes in there, especially the financial analysis. But what came out of it for me is that we had a lot of conversations that I would imagine are the same kind of thoughts and questions and conversations going about in every estate. And I think having somebody there that understands the process, like Johan does, having been through it in great detail, it makes it an awful lot easier to get some perspective and to not make the silly little mistakes that can creep in that people maybe didn't consider. A very, very simple, silly example is you can cost the replacement of a component, but if it's a component that you don't necessarily associate with a lot of labor, did you just cost the component, or did you cost the cost of the installation and the labor that goes around it? There are a lot of simple things that would seem intuitive, but one doesn't always think about. And also the way you structure the reserve study and how you break your components down, all of those things are quite important. And I think that having somebody to guide you and through those kind of questions and insights is quite important.
Jeremy, you make a really good point. If you don't mind me weighing in, I think one of the falsehoods of reserve studies is that it's all or nothing when it comes to components. So, but in many times, most of the estate managers that are on the webinar today probably look at their community and go, you know, we just need to have a little bit of money set aside to replace this path, this concrete path. We're not going to replace 5 miles of it. We're just going to replace a little bit every few years. And so some of the concepts within a reserve plan have to consider how that estate plans on using those assets. I did a reserve study for the Ritz Carlton Club. Some of you know, you've heard of the Ritz Carlton. This was in Aspen, Colorado, and part of the reserve plan was the replacement of the lobby furniture. If you've ever been in a Ritz Carlton, the lobby furniture is something that none of us could afford to put in our houses, but they can put it in their lobby. And so I gave it like a 10-year useful life. They came back to me and said, our corporate policy is that this furniture should be replaced every 7 years. So that's what I put into the plan, because the estate committee, the board, the manager may have input into the quality that they want to achieve, the timing of what they want to do, and whether it's a portion, a cyclical thing, those kinds of things. Those should all be considerations as you're building a plan. It's not an all or nothing kind of a consideration.
Thank you, Rob. I think I think we can go on for a long time. So maybe we did go into our question and answer time. I do see a question here from Quito, which I've also heard quite a few, and personally also love to hear the answer from, I think, anyone. Just chip in, please, on the panel. But it's basically the difference or the correlation between the maintenance plan and the reserve plan, and which portions are seen as operational maintenance planning, which portions are seen as reserve planning. And then the word capital is thrown in every now and again and say, but is it only for capital expenditure? So I think that's about where I start getting confused.
I'll give you my 2 cents worth. When I go into a community and I see that they have a good PM program, preventative maintenance program on components, it allows me the opportunity to extend the useful life of a component. If I know a component is being well maintained, it's going to last longer than a component which is just left to be. And so if there's a good maintenance plan on at least critical components, lifts, pumps, those kinds of things, it absolutely influences how long those components will last. And so it's critical. And there are a lot of communities out there that have no maintenance plan at all. It is a separate analysis. It's a separate document. It's a separate thought process. But it has an influence over the reserve plan for sure. In my view, it does. I don't know, Jeremy, you may see the same. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I agree with you, Rob. I think we viewed things, differently. And I think, as you said, not differently to what you're saying, but obviously we didn't have the experience of what happens in America, etc. So to me, it was more of a conversation. So when you chat to an estate manager and you understand what their maintenance program looks like, then you can give input. But for example, let's say, repainting your boundary wall, which is 1.5 kilometers long, is not the replacement of infrastructure. It is actually a maintenance function. But to me, that kind of large capital expense should go into a capital reserve study or a plan so that we're funding it, unless you're really effectively doing it elsewhere. So I think you can choose what components and what functions you want in a reserve plan and what you don't. And I think that, certainly from our software point of view, you've got the flexibility of doing that. But I think it's very important. If it's not in your operational budget under maintenance, it should be in your capital reserve study, especially if it is a regular, ongoing, large cost maintenance intervention on a cyclical basis every number of years. I don't know how you feel about that, Rob.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we were talking about maybe three different things. One is a preventative maintenance plan, which I probably threw into the conversation, which influences how long a component should last. But the second thing is an ongoing maintenance plan. In our view, in my view anyhow, if an item occurs on an annual basis, regardless of whether it's capital in nature or not, and the cost is a fixed cost, we're going to spend $2,000 painting the perimeter wall every year. That's an operational expense that doesn't go into the reserve plan. If it's more than 2 years out, then it would go into a reserve plan. And if it's an unpredictable cost, so we think we're going to spend $2,000, but it might be $1,500, it might be $2,500. Then at the time that the event occurs, then that would go into a reserve plan. So anything more than a year out would go into a reserve plan for me.
That makes sense. Makes sense to me.
I think, Adrian, for me, the takeaway is it's important that there's a discussion and a philosophy from the estate, how they approach things, where they are in their life cycle, how much funds do they have at the moment, how good is their maintenance plan. Some estates run great maintenance plans. Some estates run on a 100% run to fail. They do no maintenance until the pumps break up or things break down. The old saying of 5 rand repair today becomes a 10 rand repair tomorrow. If you don't do it preventively. And also, in our cases, there's a mixture. Some estates, the roads belong to council, and councils come in and they maintain it. But in some estates, they don't. What we see now is that some estates got to fork out money to maintain roads that belongs to council. Council don't have the money to do it, and they have to. The residents say, but we don't want potholes, and we have to fix it. So all those things, play a role in it. What is quite sad for me is that some estates, after 25 years, suddenly comes with a special levy because they want to upgrade stuff. That's bad planning. That's not great. It's not a great reflection on the management team, and on that specific estate. But planning, and one doesn't fit necessarily all, because of the little nuances on the estate, who owns it and what it belongs to in the lifespan. Thanks.
I know we were out of time, but let me just give you one final philosophy. And that is that in every estate, the effort made by the committee on the common area property that they're responsible for has a direct reflection on the property value of the individual units or individual lots or homes that are within that community. And I think oftentimes that gets overlooked. If an estate fails to maintain its common area, it's a direct reflection on the value of the individual units. And that's why it's important to fund those by the individual units, because they derive the benefit of that in the long run.
Rob, on a comment on that, in South Africa, we can see it, we experience it daily. You go through certain towns, and I'm talking local authority, where they really spend the money and it looks great. And then you come to some local authorities where there's nothing, where roads over 20 years deteriorated, there won't be enough money to do it again. So we see it. I see it at some estates. I go there, drive through the gate, you can see they haven't painted the roads for a while, they haven't done road markings, you can see the curbs, you can see the paving. They don't spend money on, and then you can see it in the houses and the whole sort of, the whole philosophy on the estate and the mood of the residents that live on that specific estate.
It's the same thing here.
Unbelievable. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. I know we can go on for a very long time. I think we're going to stop here. It was really a privilege to have Jeremy, your time, and Rob, your time as well, and Johan's your time. I just took out that it's quite a complex subject. I think I speak about this often, and just listening to you guys again, I also realized that it's quite a deep and complex subject. So thank you for the time. Let's record a session. As we mentioned, there was a few questions for contact details. Maybe I know we can share it with Jeremy's contact details, even Rob's and Johan. And then, as I did mention, that GLOVent is operating and maintaining, reselling the core software in partnership with Johan. So those who are clients already, you're welcome to speak to your account managers. And those who aren't, still speak to us, please. So yeah, that's the story. Thank you very much. And then we'll also publish in the future Wednesday webinars soon. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Hey, it's
Thank
good to
you
see
very
you all.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well.